Hey everyone, this is Louis7 and I'm back with another part in my Endgame and LOTRO mini-series, which I know it's been many months since my first part, but I did always intend to continue the series, and I'll actually talk towards the end of this video on why it's been so long, or at least why I think it's been so long. Anyway, as a quick refresher, in the first part, we overviewed what Endgame is like in LOTRO, and I talked pretty much about my opinions on the state of Endgame in general and Endgame content. And as I mentioned in that video, there are a lot of exciting things about Endgame, but there's one big issue I believe that is holding Endgame back for LOTRO, and maybe even player retention at high levels, and that is grinding. Not necessarily grinding at Endgame, but the grinding to get to Endgame and get your character like comfortably viable enough to run group content at Endgame. And along with that, as you can see in the title, I just believe it comes down to there being too many barriers to entry is kind of the way I think of it. And all of that again was briefly overviewed in the first part, but now that a few months have passed, I have been able to incorporate the feedback. Everybody that commented on that first video, I definitely appreciate it, and all the other polls I ran about Endgame and just trying to get what people think of Endgame. I was able to take in all that feedback and hear all this input from all these different players, so all that was appreciated. But anyway, I can use that information going forward to actually know what different players from different communities and just all these different perspectives people have. I can take that in with future videos, but that is not the point. I did just want to share my appreciation for that. The point is, for this video, I want to be focusing on endgame gating in LOTRO as kind of the way I think about it. And to do this, I will first just introduce the progression systems that lead to this grindiness and what I consider gating, and then the latter half of the video I will just be talking about why I think all this matters and why it's like an ongoing problem for LOTRO. So, to begin with Endgame itself, that is actually going to be a grindy thing where you go through progression systems, and I think that is okay because that is just what you expect in an MMORPG. You expect to progress at Endgame and have grindy things to do. It actually gives you exactly that, things to do, and it helps people stay interested in the game. So I do not believe Endgame grind is a problem. The problem I actually find is, again, with getting to Endgame and some of the grindy systems in LOTRO that gate people from getting to Endgame, I believe. And one of the first ones you might think of is actually leveling, but that is something you expect kind of standard in the MMO genre for people to have to level to get to Endgame, and it's not really the focus of this video, even though there are 130 levels in LOTRO. That's a lot of leveling you have to do, especially like on alts or the such, but you can actually level very fast in LOTRO, I will say. But if you choose to level fast, you do like this power leveling method, you actually leave your character very gimped, because if you do that, you will not be going through and progressing through these progression systems, which is where I think the gating and grindiness really begins. And it's something perhaps if you play one character and do all the deeds while leveling, all that sort of stuff, you may not actually run into this issue. But for people who skip around a little bit and just want to level up what I consider my old MMORPG style, I just like level through a zone, and then when I get to the level of the next zone, I just want to go there, not necessarily go through every single quest in a region, even go through all the book quests, especially thinking on alts again, or even do every deeds as there are in LOTRO. Wouldn't really always want to do that. I'd just be ready to move on to the next area and get closer to endgame. But with these three systems that there are in LOTRO, there's first the class trait system, and of course that is where you boost your character, boost your class actually, and emphasize their role in building your character up in that way. And then the second one is going to be the virtue trait system, which is the system of traits that boost your character stats. And the third is legendary item system, and this is probably the most infamous of them all, with the imbued legendary items, specifically at level 100 plus. So those are the three systems that you have to do a lot of grinding to get your character ready for endgame, in addition to just leveling. So briefly, I do want to cover each system and a little bit why they're bad. And with class traits, I actually don't find that system itself inherently bad, but it is with the class trait points and you having to do all this very specific and sometimes seemingly totally irrelevant content, at least irrelevant thinking in terms of endgame, which is of course what this video is about. You have to do all that content to get your trait points. Some trait points are locked behind quests, deeds, promotion points from epic battles even, which aren't really the most relevant content anymore. And with the quest, there are two zones, two regions actually, which each of their zones have trait points tied to them, and that is Western Rohan and Central Gondor. So for like doing alts, or if you don't want to go do a full playthrough with all these zone quests in those zone, you're going to be stuck without those trait points, and of course trait points are very helpful. But that was just an example, and overall with trait points, I don't think I actually hit the point that there are just many various sources and I think unintuitive ways that aren't explained in the game and how you get your trait points. And even with these different sources, it can actually vary if they actually do and do not give trait points. At sometimes, like all these region zone quests, sometimes they don't give trait points. If it's not West Rohan and not Central Gondor, they won't actually give trait points. And things like deeds, randomly Old Anorian, you have to do the quest in Old Anorian deeds, but that's the only region where you actually have to do the deeds for trait points. And even some of the book quests, sometimes end of book quests will actually give a trait point, and sometimes they won't. It seems very random, and it's something, if you don't actually look at external resources or my upcoming guide on trait points, which may or may not be out before this video. Anyway, if you don't look at that type of stuff, then you don't really know, and you might end up with a really gimped character and not know why they're gimped or why you're not performing as well as other people until you actually realize you missed all of these trait points that you may not even have known existed. And with the topic of trait points, I could keep going on here, but I have a video entirely dedicated to the system. And as far as like personal feedback I have, I also am actually planning on a future video where I just talk about, there are like an infinite number of suggestions that I have where they can improve the trait points and how you acquire them. I plan to have that covered in a future video, but I think overall just Clash trait points is the one that bothers me the most, even if it isn't technically the most grindy or even the most stressful system of these three. I actually find it the one that bothers me the most. So that is one reason I probably spent a little bit too long on this topic, and I do think it is something that really inhibits people's interest in endgame, especially on alts and getting that variety that I know I like. And I would be a lot more active with endgame if I did not have to get trait points on my alts, because my ideal endgame experience is I actually go through a lot of the content on alts and I get the variety of gameplay, but I do not, and that is where I will leave trait points. We can go ahead and move on to virtues would be the next one. So with virtues, the system saw a revamp, and with the revamp, players have a lot more freedom, which I believe is a good thing. You have more choice in how you can rank up your virtues, but overall it is a lot more grindy. And essentially in LOTRO, you have to do tons and tons of deeds. Deeds is going to be the primary source. I know there are other ways you can get virtue XP, and missions is actually a relatively decent way now that they have updated the weeklies with missions. You can actually get virtue XP from that, but deeds is going to be the primary source, and you have to do tons of deeds to get your virtue XP. And I actually should point out that if you do every single deed in the game, you will not get enough virtue XP to level up every single virtue, and that is a problem. But why it actually is a problem is because virtues are very useful. For even entry-level content, having your first 5 virtues up is going to be significantly helpful for your character. Now, I will say to get every single virtue up is not necessarily too important unless you're interested in doing the regular endgame progression, because you really do need your virtues up for higher difficulty, higher tier content, and it will definitely make your time easier because your character will be better built, because you'll get all the passive boosts from having all these virtues that you don't necessarily have slotted. You'll get all the passive boosts from those, and it can be pretty significant at the level cap. And I personally think, at least in my experience, for most people who want to go through endgame and go through the progression, they are interested in doing these higher tiers and working to do the higher tiers, get better gear, and continue going through the higher tiers and get the more challenging content. I think that is what a lot of people want, and for that you will need to get your virtue XP up to start going through that endgame progression system. And this is something you really have to work on from your character at the very beginning. At like level 7, when you get out of the intro, you already need to be focusing on virtue XP at that point, and that's why I believe it is a barrier, especially for people who don't do that, and especially for people who want to play alt, such as myself. And that is actually where my suggestion for improvement on virtues comes in. I know I didn't go specifically on trait points, but just to briefly explain, my suggestion for improvement on virtues to make them less grindy and less gating is actually to make virtue XP account wide. That way people who play alts don't feel punished on their main characters for actually spending time on alts and doing different zones, getting different deeds done on their alts, rather than on their main character, for example. So if virtue XP is account wide, that would alleviate that problem, but still for a single character, you would still have to get a lot of virtue XP. I think this would be a little bit more of an extreme change, but to help with that issue, I actually think they could make it so high level virtues take a lot more virtue XP to get, but then only the high level deeds are what are going to give you a ton of virtue XP. So like the latest content in LOTRO is the main source of your high virtue XP gainers versus low level stuff. Like if you're level 7 in Era of the Wind and doing Era of the Wind deeds, they won't really contribute all that much for the high level virtues. But then this also serves as a catch-up mechanic. This is probably a theme you might notice in this video. There is a huge lack of catch-up mechanics in LOTRO, and that is definitely true with virtues. And with that, just if you are gaining more virtue XP for the higher level virtues, of course all the low level virtues will quickly be boosted up, and you can get to some sort of like baseline level for whatever content you're running through. For endgame content at like level 130 right now, if they had catch-up mechanics, you could quickly get through the low levels of virtue and then go through that actual progression as endgame progression rather than progression to get to endgame as a barrier for endgame. Anyway, we can go ahead and move on from the virtues, and I hope that suggestion for improvement did really help maybe contextualize why I believe virtues are a problem, and especially, again, thinking in terms of alts. But anyway, for the last character progression system, that is the imbued legendary item system, and I have actually had many videos dedicated to the system, and every single time I have a video on imbued legendary items, it wears me out talking about it. And I think that is something that can highlight the problem, that me just thinking about the system and thinking about making videos on the system is actually stressful, and I do not believe that is a good thing for a system in the game to be stressful. It should be something like you progress your legendary item and it's actually fun to go through that, and you feel a sense of progression. You get like this reward for progressing through it. Your character becomes more powerful. But for me, at least, I always think of it as a stressful thing, and I think a lot of players think it is really needlessly complicated and just needlessly grindy as well. Even I just hear so many people quit LOTRO actually because of imbued legendary items. As much as I find the other two things annoying, I think this is the biggest thing actually from the community. People quit because of the grind with legendary items, and these are very important because they're directly tied to your character's power level, not only in terms of damage and weapon DPS, but also for tactical classes, their tactical damage and healing and the such like that. And it is even true, you actually need a powerful imbued legendary item for even high-level solo content. So it's almost something that not only gates endgame content, but high-level solo content, because if you're going through like Mordor, for example, or even beyond Mordor is where I really noticed this start happening, if you don't have a bunch of starlit crystals put into your imbued LI, you're going to have a fairly weak legendary item, and if you have a weak legendary item, it will just take a very long time to kill things, and going through solo content will be very difficult if you do not go through previous grinds to actually get your starlight crystals and the such to empower your LI. And I believe that is a big issue, and again, a lot of people actually tend to quit LOTRO. It sounds like, at least in my experience, I feel a little bit of a special position as a content creator because I hear all these comments about people, the things they like and dislike about the game, and imbued legendary items really is one of the top ones because it's just such a grindy and complex thing overall. And I would have suggestions for improvement on legendary items, but I know they're actually working on a revamp, so this is something that I am hopeful for the future that this will just not be a topic for a video like this. I am also a little bit concerned if it ends up too much like Virtue XP. If it ends up being still very grindy and something you just need to do tons and tons of things while leveling and not necessarily just at endgame, then I think it can be a big issue, but we will have to see on the revamp. And one of these suggestions, I actually should point out, the one suggestion I have is to make it only tied to item XP, and that's just how you level your imbued legendary item. You just get item XP, and you get item XP, you already get it from all these various sources. Basically anything that gets your character XP, you also progress your LI, and they could have like a level cap for the LI based on your character's level, so you can't get an insanely strong imbued LI like you actually can now. If you do a ton of grinding, you can get like a level 130 strength imbued LI at level 100, and that would actually be kind of crazy, but that would also help that issue. Anyway, we can go ahead and move on because we have covered the 3 long-term character progression systems, and I think overall they each individually actually contribute to making the game more grindy, and they serve as barriers to entry to endgame other than just like plain old leveling. I really like the days where you could level in an MMORPG and then you are ready to go through endgame, you can gear up and all that regular stuff at endgame. That is something that I feel like I've been missing lately, especially with LOTRO, and that is one reason y'all haven't seen me play as much endgame content, but we'll get to that in a minute. But just to go back to the point here, I will say that each of these things individually do contribute a little bit to the grindiness and decreasing accessibility, but it's when you combine these three major systems, having to do all three of them and focus on all three of them while leveling and the such, I think that is really where the issue comes in, because you have all these working together and it just creates, instead of like being a small barrier and then the barrier keeps getting bigger as you keep going with these systems. But to go ahead and move on, we briefly mentioned Endgame Grind in general, and as I talked about, that is actually something that I don't think is a problem because it gives people things to do and all that sort of stuff, and it's not really the topic of this video. So I will be covering that later as a sort of reminder. At least I would like to cover that later if this Endgame and LOTRO series actually starts to take off a little bit more. But anyway, what I want to do for the later half of this video is talk about why all of this is important, why all these grinds are so bad in my opinion. And the first part here is actually has to do with the MMO genre in general. And one of the biggest draws of MMOs is going to be endgame and running group content with like a few other players doing things such as instances and raids, and then you progress through the reward system, you get new and better gear so you can take on bigger and harder challenges and all that sort of stuff. And I think for people who are interested in the MMO genre in general with LOTRO, and just even LOTRO players are naturally going to be interested in running endgame content. And I know LOTRO is a little bit, say, unique because of its connection to Lord of the Rings and having really rich story that a lot of people play for like the story and leveling content. But if they do become interested in endgame because of the MMO genre and playing through the game, definitely see people getting interested in it, they might experience or hear about the grind and that just like kind of kill their interest. And that is something I, as a content creator, again, feel like I'm in a special position because I hear comments like this all the time where people just give up on the game when they notice all these grinds, especially with the imbued legendary items. But even with the trait points and virtue XP, people don't really seem to like doing those to have to get ready for endgame. And even at high levels, again, going through some of the solo content, if you don't go through some of these, it can be quite difficult sometimes to just go through regular leveling and book quests and actually experience the story. So there's even that issue going on as well. And I think the point here, you all probably get it. People become less interested in endgame and they become less interested in the newer series of LOTRO. But the problem is probably obvious from like Standing Stone Games' perspective. Those are the developers of LOTRO. It seems obvious that they don't want people to become disinterested in the game. They want people to be buying the latest expansions and become long-term customers. But if they run into these grinds and become disinterested in the game and stop playing, this will be bad because one, it would actually decrease in-game population. Having a high population is good for a huge number of reasons. In addition, they would lose some revenue on people who would enjoy endgame without these grinds or actually get to endgame and be buying the latest expansions if there wasn't this barrier that kind of stopped them. And that, of course, for Standing Stone Games would mean they get more money, which seems like it would be an obvious thing they want. And I don't know, I would guess that they have some sort of marketing or some sort of decision where they decided it's like not valuable to decrease these grinds or something. And I don't really know. I shouldn't get too much into details on with that just because I don't really know, but I feel like it's something that they should actually have motivation to keep players retained in the game and keep them interested so they actually get to endgame and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, we can go ahead and move on, and I just briefly want to talk about why you all haven't seen me actually play too much endgame lately and why that could actually be a little bit of an issue. So actually thinking about alts is going to be the main reason I haven't played as much endgame. What I play is kind of endgame-ish is what I would describe it. I don't really go through all these grinds, or I just do it on one character, and when I decide I want variety or something, I either play a different game, or I just play low-level characters. And perhaps this might not seem like a problem. It's something I enjoy and all that sort of stuff. Do group content actually at low levels as well. Have like level capped groups in my kinship at like 50, 60, 75 and the such, where we don't even have much of these grinds to worry about. The main thing would be virtue XP. At those points, actually a little bit clash traits, but they're not that hard to get. I don't really consider it too much of a grind before level 95, or really before level 85. It kicks in at level 85 with West Rohan and then all these other sources beyond that. But anyway, that is not the point of what is going on here. The point is, as a YouTuber, when people search for like Lord of the Rings online on YouTube and some of my videos come up, they will not see me playing Endgame all that much, or they will come across a video like this where I'm just criticizing Endgame for being grindy. And when people do come across these videos, they will probably be less interested in Endgame, which of course, from Standing Stone Games' perspective again, they probably don't want that. So it's also something when they have a lot of community reaction that is going to be negative to these things in Endgame and the grind there. That is another thing that could actually drive players away and drive players from buying the latest expansions and playing the latest content, which of course I would love if more people played LOTRO, more people to play with, higher populations. Again, there are tons of good reasons for a high population, but more people to play with is one of the big reasons. And I just really wish I could actually praise Endgame and have a lot more positive things to say about it, but if I don't really play Endgame, I feel like I would be dishonest if I would say that like Endgame is great and there are no issues with it, because I do believe there are grindy issues that I especially experience, again, thinking about playing with my alts. And just with playing with alts, I really like that variety, and I can't really get that variety if I think about my alts. I just lose motivation on them, is the problem. So if there's a new update that comes out, like update 30 Blood of Azog, which will be coming out, my strategy lately has been that I will run through the new content and then I'll probably run the instances a couple or a few times, but after that it just kind of gets stale, because I think about wanting to play alts and then I'm like, oh, I don't want to go through all these things, all these gating things that I have maybe done on one character. I don't want to do them on my alts, and then I just don't really want to play my alts. I don't have much motivation on them to actually run through the new content. So I just kind of get bored with it and want to do something else, either in the game or outside the game even. And that is a big issue, and that's probably one of the reasons with this series, the Endgame and LOTRO series, I just think about all these negative things with Endgame rather than the positive things. And I think about me not really running it as much, and then I'm like, okay, I don't really want to do this Endgame and LOTRO series, even though I've honestly had this video planned for many months now. I had this planned since probably a couple months after that very first part, after I was able to take in the feedback. It took me so long to get to this just because I think about all these negative and annoying things about Endgame and the reasons I'm not playing it rather than the positive things. Like, I love group content in LOTRO. I really like playing with people, playing with my kin, doing group content and all that sort of stuff, but with a video like this, I really do think about these things that make Endgame annoying and kind of think about the fact that I want to play all my alts and the such, and grind is not the only reason I don't play my alts. There are also some issues with balance and certain classes being very weak, certain specs being weak that I would like to play at endgame, but don't really feel like I can do that as well because they are really weak, and I feel like I'll be bringing my group down. Like, for example, if I wanted to take a Redline Guardian to like a tier 2 raid with my kinship, I would obviously be able to perform a lot better if I took my Warden instead as a DPS. So that is another issue I run into. It's not just going to be the grind, just to give you all the full context, but the barriers are definitely still going to be a big thing. But anyway, I feel like that is enough rambling and ranting. I think the later half of this video really got off the rails, and I do want to quickly review what we actually talked about. Go back to Earth here, or Middle Earth, for a moment. So I covered, first of all, the barriers to endgame and LOTRO outside of leveling, and kind of all the pre-endgame grinds, as I would call it, involved there. And then we talked about why that's all important, and a little bit why I haven't played endgame as much lately. And with this video, I do want to point out this is the first video I am actually recording with my new microphone. I don't know if this will be the first one up, but any feedback is going to be appreciated. And just overall, I hope it sounds better than the old one. That is the main goal. And also for this video, I'm interested to hear y'all's thoughts on endgame and LOTRO and the gating. If you think it's like as bad as I do, think it's not as bad, or think it's this huge issue, or you quit LOTRO because of it, all that type of stuff, I would be interested to hear actually more people's thoughts on it, get new perspectives on that. I would definitely appreciate that, so if you could comment that. Also, if you have any requests on videos you would want to see in this mini-series on Endgame and LOTRO, please do comment those below as well. And with that, I hope you all did enjoy the video and maybe learn something useful about Endgame and LOTRO with it. And if you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content, and thanks for watching, everyone.